Hello and welcome. I'm Teresa Fears from the Partnership for Safety program at the Arc of Spokane. This short video is for people interested in learning more about sexual abuse prevention for children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This video will show how beliefs about sexuality can negatively impact people with IDD and how by changing these beliefs we can increase their safety and reduce rates of abuse. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are people. They have the same emotional and physical needs as anyone else. This includes the need for intimacy in relationships and to express one's sexuality. Sexuality is connected to both personal and social development. Some of the developmental dimensions are physiological and psychological, social, gender identity, sexual identity, and feelings of attractiveness. However, accepting the sexuality of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is still a struggle for many parents and professionals. When faced with the issue of sexuality, unfortunately, a very common reaction is that of fear. Different groups of people fear different things. Parents may fear that they are not competent to teach their child about sexual development or other sexually related topics. They may also be unsure about how much their child is really understanding. They may also fear that by merely talking about sex, their child will become curious and begin experimenting. This leads to the fear of pregnancy. Therefore, many parents choose to simply ignore the subject. Communities fear what they do not understand. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are only now taking their place as community members, and unfortunately, many of their fellow citizens have little or no knowledge about intellectual disability. This lack of education contributes to misunderstandings, which in turn lead to fear. There are also deeply held cultural beliefs about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that reinforce these fears. Let's look at the 4 most common beliefs. The first belief is that of the eternal child. In this scenario, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are thought of as a child trapped in a grown-up body. You hear this belief reflected in statements such as, "She's 30 years old, but she has the mind of an 8-year-old." The reality is that although a person may process and understand information similarly to that of an 8-year-old, that processing is going on in a body with all the hormones, feelings, and desires of a 30-year-old adult. By thinking of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as children, it then becomes impossible to also think of them as sexual beings. The end result of this belief is that adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities become trapped in an eternal childhood where they are never allowed to grow up. The next belief is that of the wholly innocent. In this belief, having an intellectual disability is thought to be offset by having a closer relationship to God. The intellectual component of the disability is also responsible for creating a state of perpetual innocence. The words angel and angelic are frequently used when this belief is manifested. This belief is dangerous because angels are sexless beings. They are asexual. This belief strips away any possibility of sexual expression. Should there be a demonstration of sexual interest, then the very next belief is activated. The next belief is that of inborn sexual deviancy. In this belief, all people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are born amoral and are sexually uncontrollable because of their intellectual disability. It also implies that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are a danger to the community, particularly to children. As bad as the first 3 beliefs are, they are not as potentially harmful as the last belief. The last belief is that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are subhuman. They are not fully human beings. This belief springs, in part, from the idea that IQ is the criteria by which humanness is determined. This belief sends the message that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are actually equivalent to animals. There are unfortunately many examples of this belief to choose from, but this example is fairly recent and made the international news. In 2011, in England, a councilman, Colin Brewer, was censured for grossly offensive comments. He said that disabled children cost the council too much money and should be put down. He then compared children with disabilities to deformed lambs. Because of these beliefs, the sexuality of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is ignored or actively denied. Consequently, education about sex or issues related to sexual development are withheld. As a result, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have these human, emotional, and physical needs are sent into the world with no way to understand them. Attempts to meet these needs may be awkward or considered inappropriate. These attempts may be labeled as problem behaviors, which are then controlled through behavioral modification and/or medication. The individuals in question may also acquire defamatory labels such as sexually indiscriminate or sexually aggressive. These labels can affect housing placements, employment, and socialization opportunities. However, ultimately, the most destructive consequence of denying sexuality are the rates of sexual abuse within this population. Research on sexual abuse of girls with intellectual and developmental disabilities indicates that the rates of sexual abuse may be as high as 4 out of 5 girls. Compare this to the rates for typically developing children, which is 1 in 5. Boys with intellectual and developmental disabilities fare no better. They are assaulted at twice the rate as their typically developing peers. Some studies report that more than 80% of people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual abuse at some point in their lives. Of the 80% who are sexually abused, almost half of them will be abused 10 or more times. Let me say that again. Almost half will experience sexual assaults 10 or more times. Who are these perpetrators and how are they connected to their victims? One study found that 92% of the perpetrators of sexual abuse against people with intellectual and developmental disabilities had relationships with their victims. These relationships included friends, co-workers, acquaintances, family members, and disability professionals. Please note that only 8% were strangers. Most of the perpetrators had placed themselves in positions of authority or trust with their victims. Rates of abuse are stunning, and they can be directly attributed to denying sexuality. When the sexuality of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is denied, education about sexuality becomes unnecessary. Without education, people are unable to recognize abusive relationships, have no vocabulary to describe their abuse, and do not know who they can talk to get help. When abuse goes unrecognized, there is no opportunity for therapy. Without therapy, there is little chance to recover from the trauma of sexual assaults. Therefore, the direct consequence of denying sexuality of people with intellectual and developmental disability is that they are given no education with which to protect themselves, made to be vulnerable to abuse, and, after the abuse, are provided no help to recover. In conclusion, the roots of sexual abuse prevention for children, youth, and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities is the acceptance of their sexuality. Only then will it make sense to provide the education that will increase their safety and personal happiness. Please look for the next YouTube video in this series on sexual abuse prevention. It will be about education for prevention. If you are interested in learning more about the Partnership for Safety, please go to the ARC of Spokane website. For a brief overview about sexual abuse of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, please visit the ARC of US website. And finally, to learn more about the field of sexual abuse prevention, go to the CDC website. Thank you for viewing this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.